Well, everyone, it's time for us to go and take a look at the OnePlus 7 Pro and see how this specific phone has been holding up for the last few years. Now, if you remember back in 2019 when this phone first came out, it was probably one of the most hyped up OnePlus phones that I've ever probably been aware of, but it's probably one of the most hyped up phones of 2019. Now, 2019 was an amazing year for a bunch of devices. We had the Samsung Galaxy S10 that came out that year, the iPhone 11s that came out, the Pixel 4 that came out, which really wasn't that great, but the OnePlus 7 Pro that came out the summer, kind of that year, it was, I think, ahead of its time. And because of its body, it in and of itself was an amazing release. And I really like OnePlus during this time. Nowadays, I don't really know where their head's at. I don't really, keep track of OnePlus that much anymore. But this was one of my favorite OnePlus phones of all time, and probably one of my phones that came out in 2019. Now, if you want to pick up some phones I would recommend this year, links will be down in the description. You can get them from there and you can help support the channel at the same time. Now, the screen, I think, was one of the more perplexing things about this phone. So OnePlus, just like how they've done with most years, they did release a OnePlus 7, but they also released the Pro model as well. And the OnePlus 7 was also a pretty good phone. But the OnePlus 7 Pro in and of itself was probably one of the craziest phones because of what it brought on its display. So for one, it was a very big display, 6.67 inches. It was a fluid AMOLED display as well, 1440p display. So that in and of itself is already some really decent, it's a pretty good display just even what I just told you. But that's not even the craziest thing. At that time, it had a 90 Hz panel. It still has a 90 Hz panel, but a majority of phones in 2019 did not have anything higher than a 60 Hz screen. The Galaxy Note that came out, the Galaxy S10 that came out, the iPhones that came out, every phone that year besides the Google Pixels that I can remember from like a mainline flagship only had a 60 Hz display. So the fact the 7 Pro could go up to a 90 Hz panel was awesome, and I really, really loved that. But that's not even everything. This phone at that time had no bezel on it. It was pretty much a bezel-less phone. It didn't even have a camera, bezel on it either. It didn't have a whole punch display. You probably remember this. The camera actually, popped up from the top of this specific phone. So that was another thing that was just so crazy. The fact that we had a phone like that during this time was insane. Now, I personally didn't, I like the concept of it, I like the design of it, but I didn't like how the camera popped up. I kind of wish they either found a way to put it under the display, maybe like with a hidden thing that didn't stand out. Like, I don't really know. I wouldn't have minded a whole bunch either. The OnePlus 8 I think was perfectly fine. I just, when it's a hardware thing where the camera has to bump up, I don't know. I feel like it could easily be broken, but that was a very interesting concept that they made on the OnePlus 7 Pro that they did end up keeping for the 7T Pro as well. Now, those are pretty much the main things of how this phone stood out, I think, against the main competition of that year. And like I said, I think OnePlus did a tremendous job with that. The marketing of it was pretty good too. On the bottom, we had our USB Type-C charger, which was awesome. And on the back, we had our standard glass back. We had this kind of like triple camera setup on the back too, which I think was okay. And I think, we'll definitely talk about that in a second. But when you compare this phone with how the Galaxy S10 Plus looked, the Pixel 4 XL looked, the iPhone 11 Pro Max looked, I mean, this phone, in my opinion, was ahead of those phones by quite a large margin. And it took Apple until 2021, a full 2 years later after this phone's release, to even get up to 120 Hz. So this phone already had 90 Hz before the Galaxies did it and before pretty much the Pixels did, if you think about it. So that was a very cool thing, and I do really like OnePlus a lot because they went down that direction first, kind of. Now, on top of that, with the cameras, this was probably not the best thing about this phone at all. So on the back, like I said, triple camera setup, 48 megapixel wide-angle lens, 8 megapixel telephoto lens, then a 16 megapixel ultra-wide camera, and on the front, you had a motorized pop-up 16 megapixel wide-angle lens. Now, on the back, you could do 4K at 60, and on the front, you could do 1080p at 30. Those resolutions were pretty decent for that time. Majority of other phones were already doing 4K at 60 on the front, but still is totally okay. Now, one thing I liked about OnePlus was that they did put a ton of features built right into that camera. So they pretty much gave you all the features that you wanted at that time. So there was a lot of, cool built-in features, and I look at their camera UI now on the OnePlus 11 and I have no idea what they're doing. This time it still made a lot of sense what they were doing, and it looked pretty decent. Now, the camera features in and of itself is not, it's not really that great of a camera. I think definitely when compared to something like the iPhone 11 Pro Max, or especially compared to something like the Galaxy S10 Plus, it really didn't hold up too well against those phones. But I think for the novelty of that pop-up camera, I think that was enough for people to think it was a cool concept of a camera, and I think that deserves some merit. But the camera itself, you were able to zoom in some, you're able to zoom out some. I think that's probably good enough for some people, but it probably wouldn't be the first camera I would recommend buying, especially from 2019. The Galaxy S10 had a much better camera than this thing. So when it comes down to that, I would probably tell you this camera, it's okay. It's definitely not that great, but it wasn't horrible either. So I think we kind of leave it at that. Now, one of my favorite things of all time from OnePlus was Oxygen OS. Oxygen OS, back then was a very smooth, very good performing version of software. I loved it a lot. It started with Android 9, it did go up to Android 12, and this was a very good version of software. And then when, I think it was like Android 13 or Android 12, actually when Oxygen OS started changing a lot, and that was when things started going downhill for OnePlus. I think since then they haven't really found their footing, and they've kind of fallen all over the place. They merged, I think, the Oppo version of, Android and their OnePlus version of Android to make this weird skinned version of Android that makes no sense. OnePlus, back when this phone came out, first of all, it was still a very good version of software, and it was my very favorite version of Android. It was even more than stock Android. This was like stock Android and then some, and that was a very cool thing. But now OnePlus has completely moved away from it. It's now like a skinned version of Android with some stock features. Like, it makes no sense. I have no idea what they're doing. The OnePlus 11 in and of itself gave me so many issues. But when I bought the OnePlus 7 Pro and I used it, and even when I pick it up now, it still is actually a pretty good performing phone. It's still surprising. And the software, I think, holds a lot of it too there. I think I'm still on Android 11 on this phone, and it's still a pretty good version of software, I would say. So from that perspective, I think that kind of covers it up on the software performance side. Now, in the actual performance side, this phone had that Qualcomm Snapdragon 855 chipset with 6 gigs of RAM on the base model, but it did go up to 12 gigabytes of RAM if you wanted to spec it that high. Now, this was the better chipset of that year, I would say. If you consider the Apple A series and the Qualcomm of that year, this one had the best Qualcomm chipset, which I think was really nice. So when you are getting a phone like this, you are still getting a phone that is still having it's not an old chipset, it's not a completely old chipset. In fact, there are still lots of people who recommend, that I follow some gaming subreddits and, specifically Android gaming subreddits. And a lot of them mention, buy a phone that's at least an 855 or 865 or newer. And this one does have an 855, although I would probably recommend you can go for the Qualcomm Snapdragon 888 chipset on the S21. That's probably way better. But the OnePlus 7 Pro's performance is still not that bad. I think the best thing going for the OnePlus 7 Pro for its overall performance is that 90Hz panel. Although it doesn't speed up the phone, it doesn't make the phone faster, it does make the phone feel so much faster from that perspective. It's not even funny. So I do think that is a big thing to keep in mind, and if you're wanting to keep a phone for as long as you can, well, if you are able to get a phone that's a little bit faster than this thing, you might want to go down that direction. But I think the 7 Pro, if you want to use it for some sort of gaming thing, I think it'd be fine. But again, it's not going to be that great. If you're going to compare this thing against a Galaxy S23, it's not going to be close. But, for a budget gaming device, I think this wouldn't be that bad of an idea. But just keep in mind, if you can go for the next gen up, the OnePlus 8 or the OnePlus 9, that'd probably be better. It also had a 4000 mAh battery inside too, which was pretty good. And to kind of sum up this video, what I'll tell you is, I do think the OnePlus 7 Pro was a very good phone when it first came out. It probably had some weird issues when it first came out for sure, but I still look at this phone and I'm still very surprised about how good of a job OnePlus did. It wasn't perfect, but I think the concept of this phone, the fact that they were able to deliver, it stood across from all the other phones, during that time. And, for one, I'm still a humongous fan of the OnePlus 7 Pro, but I probably wouldn't recommend buying this phone anymore. I would much rather recommend buying something like a OnePlus 9 if you can, but even then, go for something like a Galaxy, the Samsung Galaxy S20, the S21, S22. Those phones are probably better than this one. So that pretty much covers it up. If you have any other thoughts or questions, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.